Wife secretly divorced her husband, then married his rich business partner, but the night she thought she'd escape poverty forever, she stepped straight into a game already written to destroy her. Lauren Pierce, the beautiful wife who once dreamed of power more than love, believed she had finally traded struggle for status when she left her husband, Grant, for his wealthy business partner, Cole Harrington. She wore diamonds, smiled for cameras, and told herself she'd outsmarted both men. But why did Grant's calm eyes never show pain when she walked away? Why did Cole's perfect charm feel rehearsed, as if her every move was being watched? And what secret bond tied these two men together while she believed she was winning? Lauren Pierce learned early that love didn't pay rent. Her childhood home smelled of reheated coffee and overdue bills, her mother's exhausted laughter echoing through the walls like a lie meant to keep hope alive. Every month was a battle between survival and shame. Lauren would sit on the porch steps, watching sleek cars pass by, their drivers polished and untouchable, promising a kind of peace she swore she'd someday buy. By 17, she could already imitate wealth. She copied how the rich spoke, dressed, paused before answering questions. It wasn't pretense, it was rehearsal. Even then, the omniscient truth was simple. Lauren wasn't chasing love or comfort. She was chasing power, because she'd grown up powerless. When she met Grant Pierce at a networking seminar, she didn't fall in love, she fell in strategy. He was gentle, self-assured, with the quiet kind of confidence that made people lean in. His humility felt like honesty, something rare in the polished crowd she'd begun orbiting. Grant saw her potential, her fire, and mistook ambition for passion. She saw his stability and mistook it for destiny. He proposed 2 years later, not with flash, but with meaning. In a small art gallery, surrounded by canvases of muted light, Grant knelt and told her, "I don't want to build an empire without someone who'll remind me why it matters." She said yes, not because her heart skipped, but because her mind calculated. She saw safety. A respectable man, good family, decent trajectory. She'd marry him, support him, and eventually mold their lives into the version she dreamed of as a girl watching Mercedes taillights fade into the night. But the omniscient truth whispered louder than her conscience. The man she was marrying had wealth far deeper than he ever revealed. Grant was the grandson of a shipping magnate, but he'd cut ties with old money to build something on his own. He didn't flaunt it, didn't even mention it. He wanted his success clean, unbought. Lauren mistook that humility for lack. The wedding was simple but beautiful. White roses, champagne, promises that sounded real even to her. But even then, under the lace veil and polished smiles, she felt an invisible itch, like she'd settled for potential when she could have had power. Grant thought he'd found peace. Lauren thought she'd found a stepping stone. Neither knew that their union would one day turn into a chessboard, every vow, every smile, every shared secret becoming ammunition in a war that hadn't yet begun. That night, as they danced under soft light, the photographer caught her smile mid-turn, perfect, poised, but distant. Years later, that same photograph would hang in her cafe, faded at the corners, the beginning of a story that was never truly about love at all, but about the cost of wanting more. The morning after the wedding, sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of their small apartment, painting the room in gold. Grant lay beside her, peaceful, his hand loosely resting on hers. For a moment, she watched him, searching for the spark people said came from love. But all she felt was gratitude. Gratitude for security, for certainty, for finally belonging, somewhere stable. And yet beneath that calm, something restless stirred, whispering that she wasn't made for ordinary mornings or quiet lives. Grant rose early, already checking spreadsheets, already planning how to turn his small logistics firm into something larger. His discipline impressed her, but his pace frustrated her. He talked about gradual growth, long-term partnerships, values, and trust, words that, to Lauren, sounded like the vocabulary of people who stayed small forever. When she spoke of new ventures, he would smile patiently, as if humoring her ambition instead of recognizing it. It made her feel invisible. Their first year together looked perfect on the outside. Dinner parties, social events, new clients. Lauren knew how to play the role: soft voice, elegant posture, the supportive wife who let her husband lead. But inside, she was taking notes. Every person of influence they met, every investor, Every whisper of bigger opportunities, she memorized them all. Grant didn't see it. He trusted too easily. He believed marriage meant shared dreams, not competing ones. It was at one of those business dinners that Cole Harrington entered their orbit. He arrived late, in a tailored suit, the kind of man who filled a room without saying a word. His charm was effortless, his confidence rehearsed, his wealth, the kind that announced itself quietly through the watch he didn't mention, the car he didn't boast about, the way people made space for him without being asked. Lauren noticed him immediately, and he noticed her noticing. When Grant introduced them, Cole's handshake lingered half a second too long, his smile calibrated to the kind that made women feel seen. "Grant's told me a lot about you," he said, eyes glinting with amusement. "You're sharper than he gives you credit for." She laughed it off, but those words stayed with her, replaying in her mind later that night when Grant fell asleep beside her. From that evening, something subtle shifted. She found reasons to be around whenever Cole visited. His attention felt like validation for all the things Grant overlooked: her ideas, her instincts, her hunger. Cole spoke her language: risk, ambition, speed. He made her feel like a partner, not a passenger. She began to imagine what life might look like beside someone who moved as fast as she wanted to. Grant, ever trusting, mistook her new energy for happiness. He didn't know that every laugh she shared with Cole was an act of quiet rebellion, every conversation a step away from him. The distance between husband and wife widened, invisible but unstoppable, like hairline cracks beneath polished marble. On a rainy evening, while Grant worked late, Lauren stood by the window, her reflection fractured by raindrops. The city lights below shimmered like promises. In her heart, something dangerous took root, a belief that she could rewrite her destiny. What she didn't know was that both men had already begun writing their own version of her story, and the script would end in a way no one could predict. The years that followed painted a portrait of success, but beneath the polished surface, their marriage had begun to hollow out. Grant still believed patience was strength, that empires were built quietly. Lauren believed speed was power, that waiting was a weakness she'd left behind with her childhood. Every conversation turned into a negotiation. When he suggested saving, she suggested investing. When he talked about building a legacy, she talked about living one. At dinners, she smiled in all the right moments, her laughter soft and precise, but her eyes rarely met his. She'd started dressing differently: bolder colors, sharper heels, designer handbags that appeared without discussion. Grant didn't argue. He assumed success was meant to be shared. What he didn't realize was that every purchase wasn't a celebration of their progress, it was an audition for a future. Without him, Cole became a constant presence. He and Grant expanded the business together, closing contracts that lifted them into a new league. To Grant, Cole was the perfect partner: charismatic, connected, fearless. To Lauren, he was the missing piece, proof that she had always been right about the kind of man it took to win. Cole never crossed the line, but his compliments were loaded, his silences deliberate. He understood Lauren's hunger because he carried the same disease, though his version was dressed in restraint. One evening, while Grant worked late, Lauren and Cole met at a hotel lounge after a corporate gala. The air was thick with unspoken things. She told him she admired his confidence, the way he handled risk. He smiled faintly and said, "Confidence is just pain practiced long enough that it looks expensive." That line struck her like prophecy. She felt seen, known in a way her husband's kindness never reached. Their conversations grew more personal. He asked about her childhood, and she told him about nights without power, about watching her mother cry silently when the rent was due. Cole listened like a man collecting truth, nodding slowly. "You wanted out of survival," he said. "That's not greed, that's evolution." She looked away, pretending not to blush. But he wasn't flattering her, he was studying her. Grant noticed her growing distance but mistook it for ambition. When she suggested hosting an investors' dinner alone, he smiled proudly, telling her, "You're finally taking the lead." He didn't know she was already planning her own life beyond his table. That night, while guests toasted to success, Lauren watched Cole across the room. He raised his glass subtly, a silent pact forming in that fleeting glance, danger disguised as destiny. The tension thickened in the weeks that followed. Grant still believed they were growing stronger together. Lauren was already halfway gone, and Cole, behind his charming, composure, had begun feeding small lies into both their worlds, weaving a thread neither could see. To one, he was the loyal friend. To the other, the understanding savior. But to himself, he was the puppeteer of a play that had only just begun. When Grant kissed Lauren goodnight that evening, she closed her eyes, not out of love, but habit. And somewhere deep inside, the marriage they built on trust began to collapse under the quiet weight of ambition. The first real crack appeared the day Grant came home earlier than usual. Lauren was sitting in the study, her laptop open, a faint smile curling her lips as she typed. She didn't hear him enter. On the screen was an email draft addressed to a law firm, subject line, "Private divorce consultation." Grant froze for a second, his world narrowing to the glow of that sentence. But instead of confronting her, he quietly stepped back, closing the door behind him. He didn't need to read more. He understood then that love wasn't leaving, it had already left. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Lauren slept beside him. He thought about the woman he married, the woman who once looked at him like he was safety. Somewhere along the way, that safety had turned into a cage. The next morning, he kissed her forehead as usual, as though nothing had changed, but inside him, something had hardened. He wasn't going to stop her. He was going to study her. Lauren, believing her secret safe, met with the lawyers 2 days later. She filed discreetly, arranging to keep the process off public record until finalized. It was surgical, clean, quiet, invisible. She told herself it wasn't betrayal, it was business. Grant would survive. He always did. But what she didn't know was that the law firm she'd chosen wasn't random. Months earlier, Grant had quietly placed a retainer there, anticipating one day he might need their services. When her file arrived, the lead attorney called him immediately. The trap had built itself. Cole's influence deepened. He began advising her subtly, suggesting hypothetical scenarios about women who took control of their lives after failed marriages. He told her that men like Grant rarely saw greatness in their wives until too late. She listened, drawn to the validation. In private, she called Cole her confidant. In public, she was still the picture of loyalty. But their messages grew longer, their meetings more personal. When she laughed at his jokes, it wasn't admiration, it was relief. The feeling of being understood without judgment. Meanwhile, Grant and Cole continued their business seamlessly, both men hiding daggers behind polite smiles. At a shareholders meeting, Grant mentioned a potential merger that could double their valuation. Cole nodded in agreement, eyes flicking briefly to Lauren seated across the room. Every deal, every handshake, became another move in a silent chess game. One evening, Grant returned home to find Lauren hosting a private dinner with Cole and 2 investors. She greeted him warmly, playing the perfect wife, but her eyes betrayed something colder. When Cole poured her wine, their hands brushed. Grant noticed but didn't react. He smiled faintly, as though unaware, and in that moment, Lauren mistook his calm for weakness. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Grant watched her from the doorway as she removed her jewelry. "You seemed happy tonight," he said softly. She looked up, startled, searching for meaning in his tone. "It was just business," she replied. He nodded, smiling. "Of course." When she turned away, he whispered under his breath, "So is this." The following week, her divorce papers reached his attorney's desk. He signed them without hesitation. No confrontation, no plea. The silence confused her, but by the time she'd married Cole, the paperwork was already more than legal, it was strategic. She thought she'd freed herself from one man and secured another. She didn't realize both had been studying her every move, waiting for the moment she'd think she was in control. The morning she became Mrs. Harrington, the city sparkled as if the world itself was celebrating her victory. Cameras flashed, journalists cheered, and Lauren stood beside Cole, radiant in a gown that glittered like a confession. To everyone watching, she was the woman who had climbed from middle-class shadows to high society light, the ex-wife who had married her husband's rich business partner, now the picture of success. But beneath the silken smiles, something hollow pulsed a silence she couldn't name. Grant didn't attend the wedding. He sent a handwritten note instead. No bitterness, no apology, just 4 words. "You finally got everything." She read it once, tore it in half, and never mentioned it again. Cole noticed the flicker in her eyes but said nothing. He didn't need to. The ceremony continued flawlessly. The guests toasted to love, unaware that this love was built on performance and revenge, disguised as romance. That night, as the newlyweds entered their penthouse overlooking Manhattan, Lauren exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for years. Everything around her gleamed golden mirrors, crystal lights, champagne towers. Cole stood behind her, hands on her waist, whispering, "Welcome to the life you were meant for." She smiled, believing him, not realizing he was only telling half the truth. Days turned into weeks, and the illusion grew comfortable. Lauren loved the attention, the exclusivity, the way doors opened with her name. She was no longer Mrs. Pierce, the supportive wife. She was Mrs. Harrington, the power beside power. But Cole's affection, though lavish, was measured. He complimented her, kissed her, gifted her diamonds, yet every gesture felt choreographed. Sometimes when she spoke, his gaze would wander, like a man remembering a script. She told herself it was stress, that all powerful men carried secrets. Still, the distance grew. She began catching fragments late-night calls ending abruptly when she entered the room, private meetings he never explained, files quickly closed when she approached his desk. When she asked about Grant, Cole would smirk. "He's doing fine," he'd say, his tone clipped, almost rehearsed. Then came the dinner party that changed everything. It was Cole's idea, a celebration for investors and partners. The house glowed with laughter, crystal clinks, and expensive lies. As she mingled, Lauren overheard two men whispering near the bar. "Pierce Harrington merger's looking strong," one said. "Grant and Cole really pulled it off." She froze, her smile stiffening. Grant and Cole? Later that night, while Cole was distracted with guests, she slipped into his office. On his desk were documents stamped with both their names, Grant Pierce, Cole Harrington. Her heart pounded. Every word she read blurred into one revelation. Their partnership never ended. Her new husband and her ex-husband were still business partners, co-owners, tied together by a bond she never severed. Cole found her moments later, standing still, the papers trembling in her hands. "You didn't think we stopped working together, did you?" he said softly, almost pitying. She looked at him, stunned. "What is this?" His smile was calm, unshaken. "Just business. The same kind that made you leave him." For the first time, Lauren realized she might not have married into power, she might have married into a trap. The air between them shifted, the lights above suddenly too bright. She set the papers down, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Then I hope business is good," she said quietly. Cole's eyes lingered on her, unreadable. It's always good when everyone plays their part. That night, when she finally lay beside him, the city outside still glimmering, Lauren couldn't sleep. Her dreams of victory began to feel like someone else's plan. Lauren woke before dawn, the skyline glowing pale blue beyond the window. Cole was already gone, his side of the bed cold, the smell of his cologne still hanging in the air. She wrapped his robe around her, wandering through the penthouse that felt more like a showroom than a home. The marble floors reflected her bare feet, the silence pressing against her chest. She had everything she once prayed for: wealth, status, beauty, but not peace. The kind of peace Grant gave her once without ever meaning to. Her days were filled with photographers, brand invitations, charity galas. The world saw her as the elegant wife of a rich businessman, the perfect upgrade from her past. But at night, when the cameras stopped clicking, she would find herself alone at the dining table, sipping wine, staring at the city lights, wondering why winning felt so empty. Cole would come home late, kiss her cheek absently, and vanish into his office. When she asked if everything was all right, he'd smile, that same smile he used in meetings, smooth, deliberate, reassuring but hollow. She began to notice patterns. His phone was always face down. He never left his laptop unlocked. Calls ended the moment she entered the room. Once, she overheard him say Grant's name in a tense tone during a conversation. When she asked about it, he laughed softly and said, "Business never really ends." The words lingered like a bruise. Determined to prove her suspicions wrong, she started digging quietly. A late-night glance through his briefcase revealed files stamped with both their names, Pierce Harrington Holdings. Her pulse quickened. She flipped through documents filled with contracts and signatures, Grant's signature beside Cole's. It didn't make sense. The company she thought she had married into wasn't new. It was the same firm Grant had once owned with Cole. Their partnership had never ended. It had evolved. Her first instinct was denial. Maybe it was old paperwork, something unresolved. But when she confronted Cole at breakfast the next morning, his reaction wasn't surprise, it was amusement. "You're still learning," he said quietly, his tone almost affectionate. "Grant and I built this together. We'll always be partners. You knew who I was when you married me." She stared at him, stunned. "So I left my husband for his partner?" Cole met her eyes with calm detachment. "You didn't leave him. You joined him from another door." That night, she stood by the window again, the city alive beneath her, every light mocking her triumph. For the first time, she wondered if she had ever been in control. The two men she thought she'd outsmarted were still connected through business, through strategy, through something darker she couldn't yet name. And as she watched Cole make another late-night call, whispering softly with the same precision Grant once used when negotiating, the realization sank in like ice. She hadn't escaped them. She was trapped between them, part of a plan she didn't design. Grant watched the headlines unfold from his quiet office in the city's financial district. The world believed he had vanished after the divorce, but behind closed doors, he was more powerful than ever. Every newspaper that mentioned Pierce Harrington Holdings still carried his name in the fine print, though most didn't notice. He had learned that revenge didn't require noise. It required patience. The louder someone celebrated, the easier they were to expose. And Lauren was celebrating too loudly. He had tracked every move since the divorce, the properties bought under her name, the secret accounts Cole helped her open, the lavish spending that made investors whisper. He let her believe she was untouchable. Each headline, each event, each diamond she wore was a breadcrumb leading to her own undoing. To the world, she had outsmarted him. To Grant, she was performing inside the walls of his design. Cole visited him once a week under the guise of old friendship. They met in private lounges, shaking hands over deals neither mentioned to anyone else. To outsiders, it was business. To them, it was theater. "She's starting to question things," Cole said one evening, stirring his drink. "Good," Grant replied quietly. "Doubt makes people reveal themselves." Cole smiled faintly. "You really think she deserves what's coming?" Grant's eyes lifted, calm and unreadable. "Deserve isn't the point. She made a choice. I'm just letting it mature." Meanwhile, Lauren's confusion deepened. Cole's behavior grew colder, more distant, as though she had served her purpose. The lavish attention faded into polite gestures, and her calls to him during his long absences went unanswered. She started to feel the same isolation she once blamed on Grant, only now surrounded by wealth instead of love. The irony wasn't lost on her. One afternoon, while scrolling through financial news, she froze. An article detailed a new merger. Pierce Harrington Holdings had acquired two major competitors. The press described it as a masterstroke of partnership between Grant Pierce and Cole Harrington. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't mentioned anywhere. She realized, in brutal clarity, that she was no longer part of the story. When Cole returned home that evening, she confronted him. "You used me," she said, her voice trembling. "For what?" He set down his briefcase slowly, his tone measured. "For the same thing you used Grant for: access, for image, for ambition." He moved closer, his voice dropping lower. "You thought you married power, Lauren. You married the illusion of it." That night, she couldn't sleep. She scrolled through old photos of Grant, his quiet smile, the way he used to listen, the patience she once mistook for weakness. She realized too late that he hadn't lost anything when she left. He had simply stepped aside, letting her dig her own ruin. The game she thought she played alone had two masters, and both had already won. Outside, the city lights blurred through her tears. Somewhere downtown, in an office with Grant's name still etched on the door, two men toasted to another successful quarter. And far above them, in her glittering penthouse, Lauren Pierce finally understood that her divorce had never been her freedom. It had been her initiation. Cole stared at his reflection in the mirror, his tie half knotted, the weight of what they'd done starting to bleed through the cracks of his control. The plan had gone flawlessly, too flawlessly. Grant had orchestrated every move with surgical precision, and Cole had executed it without hesitation. But now, with Lauren drifting through their penthouse like a ghost, he began to wonder if the cost of victory was heavier than the prize. He told himself it was justice, that she'd chosen greed over love. But when he saw her sitting alone at dinner, eyes hollow, it didn't feel like justice, it felt like punishment. Their conversations had become fragile, every word a test. "You're different lately," she said one night, tracing the rim of her glass without looking at him. "I'm busier," he replied. "Business is growing." She smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. That's what Grant used to say. The name hung in the air like smoke. Cole looked up sharply, then softened his voice. "Grant and I are nothing alike." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The same calm, the same strategy, the same satisfaction and control, he saw it in himself now. That night, while she slept, he stood by the window watching rain streak down the glass. He remembered the first time he saw her, the ambition in her smile, the hunger in her eyes. It was the same hunger he'd once had before he learned that power, without empathy, rots the soul. Grant understood that, too. That was why he'd let Cole lead the final act. It wasn't just about punishing Lauren. It was about testing Cole's limits. And he was failing. A week later, Cole met Grant for their routine check-in at a quiet private club. Grant looked composed as ever, his suit immaculate, his tone measured. "She's realizing the truth," Cole said, almost as a confession. "Good," Grant answered. "Realization is the first step to change." Cole hesitated. "And if it breaks her?" Grant didn't flinch. "Then she learns what we learned, some lessons require breaking." After that meeting, Cole drove home slower than usual, replaying the words. For the first time, he wasn't sure whose side he was really on. He'd started this as an accomplice, but now guilt stalked him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. When he entered the penthouse, he found Lauren asleep on the couch, her face streaked with dried tears, the TV playing an old interview of Grant discussing ethics in business. He switched it off, stood watching her, and whispered under his breath, "We're all monsters in tailored suits." Over the next days, he tried to distance himself from Grant, missing meetings, avoiding calls. He told himself it was just exhaustion, but in truth, he was unraveling. He began drafting a letter, something like an apology, though he didn't know to whom. He wanted to tell her the truth, but the truth wasn't his to tell. Grant owned it, just as he owned the story, the company, and every secret buried beneath their success. Cole lay awake that night, listening to Lauren's soft breathing beside him, realizing he no longer knew who was being played, the woman who thought she'd won, or the man who helped destroy her. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We both fell for the same illusion." The gala was supposed to be her redemption. Lauren had planned every detail, the chandelier reflections, the marble floors, the shimmering gold gown that hugged her like a promise. It was her chance to reclaim the narrative, to remind New York's elite that she was still the woman who rose from nothing. Cameras flashed as she walked in beside Cole, her hand looped around his arm, her smile practiced to perfection. Every guest turned to watch her, envy flickering behind polite applause. But somewhere in the room, Grant was watching too. He arrived quietly, no entourage, no announcement, just presence. The moment Lauren saw him across the ballroom, her pulse quickened. He was standing beside two investors, confident, composed, his expression unreadable. She hadn't seen him since the divorce, and now, standing under the lights of the same world she thought she'd conquered, she felt exposed. Cole noticed her stare and followed it. When his eyes met Grant's, a subtle nod passed between them. It was small, almost invisible, but to Lauren, it was seismic. As the evening unfolded, conversations buzzed around her, but her mind kept circling that silent exchange. During dinner, she tried to ask Cole if he knew Grant would be there. He smiled without looking up from his plate. "He's everywhere," he said simply. "You just don't always notice." The words sent a chill through her. When the speeches began, the host announced a surprise presentation, a recognition for Pierce Harrington Holdings for excellence in corporate leadership. Lauren blinked in disbelief as both Cole and Grant were called to the stage together. The crowd erupted in applause. Cole rose smoothly, adjusting his jacket, while Grant joined him, shaking hands before the cameras. The sight of them side by side, partners, equals, made her stomach twist. Every cell in her body screamed that something was wrong, that this wasn't coincidence. The two men spoke in turn, thanking each other for years of trust and innovation. Their tone was effortless, their synergy flawless. To the audience, it was a celebration of partnership. To Lauren, it was the confirmation of betrayal. Her name wasn't mentioned once. The applause sounded like thunder in her ears, drowning out the fragments of her reality. After the ceremony, she fled to the terrace, her hands trembling as she clutched the railing. The city stretched below, alive and indifferent. She didn't hear Cole approach until he spoke softly behind her. "You did well tonight." She turned, anger flaring through her confusion. "You knew," she whispered. "You and Grant, this was never about me." He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "It was always about you," he said. "You just never understood which part you played." Inside, the lights dimmed as a toast began. Grant's voice carried through the speakers, smooth and calm. "To partnership," he said. "To loyalty. To the lessons we learn from those who test both." The room laughed and cheered. Lauren's heart sank. Every word was a message, wrapped in civility, delivered for her ears alone. When she finally turned back toward the ballroom, she caught Grant's gaze across the crowd. He lifted his glass toward her, a gesture so small it could have been politeness. But the look in his eyes was colder than glass. It wasn't hatred, it was closure. That night, as the gala ended and the world congratulated her for her beauty, her success, her life, Lauren Pierce realized the truth. She had never been the star of her own story. She had been the lesson inside someone else's. The next morning, Lauren woke to silence. Cole's side of the bed was empty again, but this time the emptiness felt deliberate. The gala replayed in her mind, Grant's toast, the crowd's applause, the way both men looked at her without a trace of guilt. Her phone buzzed endlessly with media alerts. Photos of her between them, headlines calling her the woman who united two giants. To the world, she was a symbol of elegance and power. To herself, she was an ornament in someone else's empire. Determined to understand, she drove to the Pierce Harrington headquarters without calling ahead. The receptionist hesitated when she gave her name, then finally said, "Mr. Harrington is in a board meeting." Lauren didn't wait for permission. She pushed open the glass doors, her heels echoing across the marble floors. The boardroom fell silent as she entered. Around the table sat investors, directors, and at its head, both Cole and Grant. Grant looked up first, calm, almost kind. "Lauren," he said, as if greeting an old friend, "you shouldn't be here." She stood frozen for a moment, her voice trembling. "What is this? You two, how long has this been happening?" Cole leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Since before the wedding," he said simply. "Before the divorce, actually," the room murmured. Lauren's breath caught. "You planned this," she whispered. Grant rose slowly, sliding a folder across the table toward her. "We didn't plan this," he said softly. "We just stopped pretending you hadn't already chosen your side." She opened the folder. Inside were documents, contracts, transfers, records of every company and account. Cole had persuaded her to sign over during their marriage. Her name was on each one, but not as an owner as a front. She'd been the face of several shell companies, now under investigation for laundering assets she didn't own. Her heart pounded as she flipped through page after page, realizing she'd been the scapegoat in a flawless crime. Cole's expression didn't waver. Grant's remained coldly neutral. "You used me," she said, her voice breaking. Grant's eyes softened for the briefest moment. "No, Lauren. You used love. We just made sure it finally taught you something." She slammed the folder shut, shaking. "You'll ruin me." Cole's tone was almost gentle. "You ruined yourself the day you believed power mattered more than truth." The door opened behind her security. She didn't fight when they escorted her out. As she walked past the glass walls, she saw her reflection, perfect hair, perfect dress, but the face of a stranger. Reporters were already outside, cameras flashing as questions poured in. "Mrs. Harrington, are the allegations true? Were you aware of the fraud? Is it true your husband and ex-husband were partners?" She didn't answer. The flashbulbs painted her like lightning, brief, blinding, and gone. Inside, Grant stood at the window watching her leave, while Cole poured himself a drink. "You think she'll recover?" Cole asked. Grant didn't look away from the glass. "She'll survive. She's stronger than she knows, but she'll never make the same mistake twice." As the door closed behind her outside, the sound of the city roared back to life. The same city she once believed she owned now swallowed her whole. And somewhere above it all, two men toasted not to victory but to silence. The scandal hit like a hurricane. By evening, every network had her name plastered across the screen. Lauren Pierce Harrington under federal investigation. Her photo, the one from the gala where she looked untouchable, it became the emblem of deceit. Commentators dissected her life like a case study in greed. Former friends refused her calls. Brands she endorsed pulled out. Invitations vanished overnight. In 24 hours, the woman who once defined elegance became a cautionary tale. Lauren sat alone in her penthouse, surrounded by silence so loud it pressed against her ribs. The once glittering home now felt like evidence. Every painting, every designer chair, every trophy of her new life was a reminder of how perfectly she'd been played. Her phone buzzed endlessly, not with sympathy but with curiosity. Everyone wanted a quote, a denial, a confession. She gave them none. The truth was too painful to repeat. She turned on the TV just as an interview with Grant began. He looked calm, deliberate, dressed in a dark suit that radiated quiet authority. The reporter asked about the investigation. He didn't deny their shared past or his connection to the company. Sometimes, he said evenly, people lose sight of what matters. Success without integrity always corrects itself. The camera caught the faintest flicker of sadness in his eyes before the clip ended. It wasn't spite, it was closure. Lauren muted the television and sank into the couch. Cole hadn't come home since the boardroom confrontation. She'd called him once, and the call went straight to voicemail. The last time she saw him, he hadn't looked angry or guilty, just finished, like a man closing a file. She realized now that even his kindness had been strategy. Every word, every smile, every gesture had been part of something larger. When a knock came at the door, she froze. Two officers stood there, polite but firm. They weren't there to arrest her yet, only to serve notice. She signed the paper with shaking hands and closed the door quietly. Her reflection in the glass door caught her eye, still beautiful, but smaller somehow. Not the woman who ruled rooms, but one who'd finally run out of masks. She wandered into the study, where the remnants of her empire sat in boxes. In the drawer, she found the torn note from Grant's wedding gift, "You finally got everything." She read it again, and for the first time, she understood what he meant. She had gained the world but lost herself in the process. Night fell, heavy and indifferent. She poured herself a drink and stared out at the city that once applauded her. Below, the streets pulsed with life lovers, strangers, dreamers. She used to think she was above them. Now, she realized she'd never been more ordinary. She whispered to the glass, "I thought I was the player." Her phone lit up one last time. It was an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "Lesson completed." There was no message, no name, only an attached photo, a picture of her and Grant years ago at that small art gallery, when everything was still simple. She closed her eyes, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. The empire she tried to build had fallen, but for the first time, she didn't feel anger. She felt something closer to truth. Lauren stood in front of the courthouse, cameras flashing like thunder around her. The marble steps felt steeper than they looked on television. She wore a simple beige coat, her hair tied back, no jewelry, no designer perfume, just the silence of a woman who had run out of performances. Her lawyer whispered instructions, but her mind wasn't there. Every step she took echoed with memories: her wedding to Grant, her first meeting with Cole. The way ambition had once felt like oxygen, now it felt like poison. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with curiosity. Reporters lined the benches, pens poised like weapons. Across the aisle, Grant sat at the plaintiff's table, unreadable, his expression composed. Cole wasn't beside him this time. His seat remained empty, his absence louder than any presence. The judge entered, and the murmurs faded. The charges were read: corporate fraud, asset manipulation, wire misrepresentation. Each word landed like a stone. Lauren's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. When asked to plead, she hesitated before whispering, "Not guilty." The sound of her own voice startled her. She wasn't sure if she believed it. Grant didn't speak during the hearing. He sat perfectly still, watching her, not with hatred, not even pity, but something quieter. When the prosecutor presented the evidence, she saw the same documents he had shown her in the boardroom, now laid bare before strangers. Her name on contracts, her signature on accounts she never understood, every piece of paper tying her to crimes she hadn't knowingly committed. When the session adjourned, she caught a glimpse of him leaving. Their eyes met briefly through the crowd. She wanted to ask why he couldn't have just let her go, why he had to make her learn through pain. But deep down, she already knew. He hadn't done it to destroy her. He'd done it to end something that had been destroying them both long before. Outside, the cold air cut against her face. Cameras surrounded her, shouting questions she didn't answer. She moved through them like a ghost, the city blurring around her. In the car, her lawyer tried to reassure her, talking about settlements and appeals. She stared out the window, barely hearing him. The world she'd built on glamour and deceit was collapsing, but she didn't feel anger anymore, just exhaustion. That night, she sat on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker beneath a hazy sky. Somewhere out there, Grant and Cole were still building, still winning, still moving forward. And yet, for the first time, she didn't envy them. She whispered into the wind, "Maybe this is what starting over looks like." When the phone rang, she almost didn't answer. It was Cole's voice, quiet, uncertain. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said. She closed her eyes, tears burning hot against her skin. "It always goes this far," she replied, then hung up. The silence that followed was the purest thing she'd felt in years. The rain fell steady and cold when Grant found her waiting outside the courthouse, standing alone beneath the awning, her umbrella forgotten at her side. The world around them moved in blurred motion. Cars, voices, flashes of cameras, but for that moment, it felt like only the two of them existed. She didn't look up until he spoke. "You shouldn't be out here," he said quietly. His voice was calm, gentle even, stripped of triumph. She turned toward him slowly, the fatigue in her eyes deeper than any anger. "You came to watch me fall?" Grant shook his head. "No, Lauren. I came to see if you'd stand back up." His words disarmed her. She laughed once, bitter and cracked. "You win, Grant. You got everything you wanted." He studied her for a moment, the way he once did when they were still learning each other. "No," he said softly. "I lost you a long time ago. This wasn't about winning." For a long silence, the only sound between them was rain. She finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Did you ever really love me?" He hesitated. "I did, more than I should have. That's why I had to let you destroy yourself before you destroyed me." Her eyes glistened, tears blending with rain. "You could have stopped me." He nodded faintly. "I tried. Once. You called it control." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope, handing it to her. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was the title deed to the small house they once shared during their first year of marriage, the one with creaky floors and yellow curtains she'd insisted on buying secondhand. "It's yours," he said simply. "The house?" she whispered. "Why?" His gaze didn't waver. "Because that's where you were still yourself. Before all this." She looked down at the paper, her hands trembling. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked. Grant took a slow breath. "Start over. And this time, build something real." As he turned to leave, she called after him, her voice breaking. "Do you hate me?" He stopped but didn't turn around. "No," he said. "I finally understand you. You were never evil, Lauren. You were just scared of being ordinary." The rain fell harder, washing over the city, blurring the world into streaks of silver and gray. She stood there for a long time, the envelope clutched to her chest, watching him disappear into the crowd until he was gone. For the first time, she didn't chase what was leaving her. She just let it go. Back in the car, she unfolded the deed again and traced the address with her thumb. It felt almost foreign, like something from another lifetime. The driver asked where she wanted to go. She looked out at the endless gray skyline and whispered, "Home." As the car pulled away, she closed her eyes, and a memory surfaced. Grant in their old kitchen, laughing as she burned breakfast, and her mother's voice on the phone, her own laughter unguarded. It was the sound of a woman who hadn't yet learned to perform. She realized she missed that version of herself more than any life she tried to buy. Cole sat alone in his study, the glow from the city washing through the windows like a confession. The glass of whiskey in his hand had gone untouched for an hour. Papers lay scattered across his desk, contracts, board memos, the last traces of the empire he and Grant had built. For the first time in years, none of it felt like victory. He had everything he thought he wanted: wealth, power, and respect. But in the silence, it all rang hollow. The echoes of Lauren's broken voice on the phone still haunted him. "It always goes this far." She was right. It always did. He leaned back, closing his eyes, the memory of her laughter flashing like a ghost. He had once admired her ruthlessness, her ability to dream without apology. But now he saw what Grant had seen years ago, that her hunger was born of fear, and his was no different. They had both chased control to feel safe, and somewhere in the pursuit, they had become the same thing. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake the thought, but guilt clung to him like the smell of smoke after a fire. On his desk sat a letter he had written and rewritten a dozen times. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was half confession, half apology. He had started it the night Grant warned him, "You can't play God and expect to stay human." He hadn't believed him then. Now he wasn't sure what he was anymore. The letter began simply, "To the woman who believed she was winning." He couldn't bring himself to finish it. A knock broke the silence. His assistant entered quietly, handing him an envelope. "From Mr. Pierce," she said. Inside was a single line written in Grant's neat handwriting: "You got what you wanted. Now decide if you can live with it." Cole stared at the words, the truth hitting him harder than any accusation. Grant had known all along that this was his punishment, not guilt forced on him, but the slow realization that victory had no meaning when it cost everything human inside him. Later that night, he drove out to the waterfront, where the city lights shimmered against the black water. He stood there, coat whipping in the wind, watching the skyline he helped shape. In his pocket was a check made out to a women's business foundation, the same charity Lauren once lied about donating to. It wasn't redemption. It was an attempt to feel something that resembled decency. He slipped the envelope into the donation box outside their office door and walked away without looking back. When he returned home, he poured the whiskey down the sink and tore the letter into pieces. The fragments scattered across the counter, catching the light before falling still. He whispered into the empty room, "We both played her. We both lost something for it." The city outside hummed softly, indifferent. Cole leaned against the window, staring into the night until the first pale trace of dawn began to appear. For the first time in years, he didn't think about power or profit or revenge. He thought about forgiveness, how quiet it sounded, and how far away it felt. The sun rose gently over the small coastal town, painting the quiet streets in shades of gold. A bell above the cafe door chimed as the first customer stepped in, greeted by the soft hum of music and the smell of fresh coffee. Behind the counter, Lauren Pierce wiped her hands on an apron and smiled politely. The woman who once walked red carpets now poured lattes and arranged pastries with quiet precision. Her hair was shorter, her makeup minimal, her movements unhurried. The cafe's name, painted in soft white on the window, read Second Draft. Locals loved her place. They said the owner was kind but private, a woman with eyes that carried 1,000 unspoken stories. She never mentioned her past. She listened to others instead, students chasing dreams, couples arguing gently, tourists who talked about their cities. Some days, when the sea breeze drifted through the open door, she'd pause and watch the waves, her thoughts returning to the life she'd left behind. The noise of the city, the flash of cameras, the men who once defined her fate, all of it felt like a story that happened to someone else. One afternoon, a man entered, older, dressed in a gray suit. He ordered black coffee and sat by the window, reading a newspaper. For a moment, she froze. His profile was achingly familiar. Grant. His hair had grayed slightly, but his calm remained the same. When he looked up, their eyes met. Neither spoke. The silence between them was soft, no longer heavy with what-ifs. After a while, he smiled faintly and said, "You finally did it. Built something real." She smiled back, her voice steady but warm. "This time, I kept it small enough to hold." He nodded, placing a folded envelope on the counter before leaving. She watched him walk away, the bell above the door ringing softly behind him. Inside the envelope was a short note: "Peace suits you. Don't lose it." She folded it gently, placed it in a drawer beneath the register beside a faded photograph of their younger selves, and exhaled. As the day went on, customers filled the cafe. Laughter mingled with the sound of cups clinking and waves crashing outside. Lauren moved through it all with quiet grace, every step anchored in simplicity. There were no more hidden plans, no more games to win, only mornings, faces, and second chances. That evening, when she closed up, she stood outside under the fading sky, the ocean stretching endlessly before her. The air smelled of salt and renewal. She whispered to herself, not in regret but in acceptance. Maybe this was the story all along. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, older, softer, but finally whole. She smiled at it, turned off the lights, and walked home along the quiet street as the last glow of sunset disappeared behind the horizon. In the end, the woman who once measured her worth by what she could own learned that peace, once lost, is worth more than every empire ever built. And somewhere far away, in a city that no longer haunted her, two men raised a silent toast, not to victory, not to revenge, but to the only truth that outlasts ambition: forgiveness. Greed may open doors, but integrity keeps them open. Lauren had everything: beauty, opportunity, and choice, but she traded authenticity for ambition and power for peace. In chasing status, she became a pawn in the very game she thought she controlled. Real power isn't in money, control, or revenge. It's in character, loyalty, and the courage to stay real when no one's watching. Be careful what you sacrifice for success. Some victories cost your soul, and by the time you realize it, you've already paid. If you were in Grant's shoes, would you have exposed Lauren's betrayal the way he did? Or would you have simply walked away and let life teach her? Share your thoughts in the comments. I want to know what you would have done.